Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Given uncertainty around supply and soaring costs of fertiliser, tillage specialist Mark Plunkett joins us to give insight into access to supply of fertiliser and the fertiliser rate to produce the optimum yield of silage to ensure feed supply for winter.
First cut silage, where we're producing or growing 5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare or 10 tonnes of fresh grass per acre. In terms of nitrogen, we generally recommend 125 kilos of N per hectare. That's 100 units per acre. But with the increases in the cost of nitrogen, we're now saying 100 kilos per hectare or 80 units per acre of nitrogen. In terms of phosphorus is very, very important in terms of driving yield and efficiency in producing that silage crop. We're recommending 20 kilos of P per hectare, which is 16 units per acre. In terms of potassium, again, silage has a big demand for potassium. It's quite similar to nitrogen, and we're recommending 125 kilos per hectare or 100 units per acre. But just one caveat there is that in springtime, we don't apply any more than 90 kilos of potassium, which is 72 units per acre. And again, that's to reduce problems with high K and silage and milk fever, especially in the dairy herd at feed out. But it's important to remember that we should apply the remaining 35 kilos after the first cut has been taken. And not to forget, sulphur is very, very important in terms of the silage crop. And again, we recommend 20 kilos per hectare or 16 units per acre per cut. So it's quite a large demand for all the major nutrients, Emma-Louise.
So to recap, Mark, you've reduced your level of nitrogen. So 100 kilos of nitrogen, 20 kilos of phosphorus, 90 kilos of potassium and 20 kilos of sulphur. How are farmers going to deliver that level of nutrients this year?
Okay, where slurry is available, and again, silage ground, slurry is a very valuable source of fertilizer for silage ground, especially in the current year with the increases. But we'll be targeting our slurry, we'll be targeting 3,000 gallons of good quality cattle slurry, a 6% cattle slurry. And Emma-Louise, that will supply the majority of the P and K for that first cut silage crop. And it'll supply approximately 30 kilos of nitrogen. So if we're applying slurry with LESS, or low emission trailing shower band spreader, it'll give us roughly about 30 kilos nitrogen, or a third of the nitrogen for that crop. So again, when that's applied, that will be applied at closing time. So again, a week later, then we would recommend that you would apply the remaining nitrogen on that crop. So again, there's another 70 kilos there. So again, something like, protected urea plus sulfur or CAN plus sulfur would be the option there. Where there's no slurry in the mix, maybe an outblock, and you haven't slurry available for that silage ground, again, we'd be strongly recommending that you would use a blend or a compound to supply the majority of the P and K. So something like a 13-6-20, a 16-5-20, or a 10-5-25. And a 10-5-25 is quite popular out there this year because there's less phosphorus to go around. So, but that product would work very, very well for silage ground. And we'd be recommending, 3.5 bags to the acre of those products to supply a proportion of the nitrogen and all the P's and K's. And again, the same situation at closing time, you'd spread your compound, and then you'd come back then with the, if you take, say, 13-6-20, like 3 bags to the acre, will give you, about 40 units of nitrogen. So then you will come back with another 40 units of nitrogen in the form of protected urea or CAN, say, a week later. And you'd have, that would be the way of, I suppose, supplying the nutrients either with or without slurry, Emma-Louise.
And a lot of farmers are using products like cut sward, pasture sward. What's their role for silage ground, Mark?
Yeah, cut sward and pasture sward, again, they're good products, but in my book, Emma-Louise, like, they really should complement, say, your 3,000 gallons of cattle slurry, say on low fertility ground, or my concern with cut sward or pasture sward, if you apply them alone with, where there's no slurry in the equation, you won't be supplying enough P and K. Like, take 3 bags to the acre of, say, cut sward, like, it'll give you the majority of your nitrogen, but it's only going to give you about 50% of the P that you need, and it'll give you less than 50% of the K that you need for that silage crop. So again, you know what I mean, this is going to be a very, very important year, you know, with the concern around the supply of feed and fertilizer. So you know, it's very, very important that we aim to supply or balance the minimum, you know, NP and K to grow a good crop of first cut silage.
And you've alluded to cost, Mark, like, you know, and you've mentioned multiple products from slurry to different compounds and mixes of fertilizer. Could you put a cost on fertilizer for silage ground this year?
That can be a tricky one to do, and I suppose it very much depends on when you bought your fertilizer. You know, if you have bought it, in the last number of months, you'll have got it that bit cheaper than prices that are being quoted today. But if we take today's prices into account, Emma-Louise, we're probably talking somewhere, you know, you have all fertilizer and no slurry in the mix, you're probably anywhere from 230 to 250 an acre. Where you have slurry in the mix, you know, you can reduce that cost, you know, anywhere from 100 to 150 euros an acre. So, you know, slurry, you know, really should be going back, and the plan should be that we've enough slurry to go back or to feed those silage crops as we speak, because it's in the right balance in terms of P's and K's. It's not really suitable for grazing ground depending on soil fertility, but in general, you know, slurry very, very important in the current year, to supplying, you know, and delivering, you know, big amounts of P's and K's on the silage ground, and that's where you're going to get the best response to that slurry. Is on the
and Mark,
ground.
You've mentioned slurry, and you know, as you've articulated, there's a really high level of nutrients and it complements silage ground. You've put a figure on, you know, 6% solids in that slurry. Is there a space that you'd recommend farmers to get that slurry tested to ensure that it has the levels that you anticipate it has, or would you be happy enough to just go with the rate of 3,000 gallons?
Look, most definitely, we have been encouraging farmers for the last year to get the slurry tested, but definitely, you know, and there's still time, like, you know, if you're spreading slurry, getting ready to spread slurry on your silage ground, like, you know what I mean, that if you take a sample or two out as you're spreading it, send it off to the lab, you should have a result back within a week. So again, that will give you a better steer as regards what then you need to complement your slurry with, both in terms of nitrogen and in terms of P and K. So most definitely, it would be good to know what's in the slurry.
And looking at that figure, you're talking about 100 kilos of nitrogen, and it sounds like a massive figure in the context of the rising costs that you talk about. Looking at the overall fertilizer picture, farmers are looking at areas where they can pull back on nitrogen, you know, across the year in terms of grazing. But I suppose specifically when we consider silage, is there a scope for farmers to pull back on the amount of nitrogen they're putting out for first cut?
There is a little bit of scope, and it's a very good question, Emma-Louise. Like, if we take the silage crop, if we take the first 80 kilos of nitrogen that we apply, it you know, it will deliver, you know, 75% of the grass yield. You know, so that, you know, you're getting your biggest response from that first 80 kilos. The next 20 kilos will deliver about 20% of the grass crop or the grass yield. And again, there's a good payback there. You know, that, and the final 20 kilos then, like, it's the law of diminishing returns. We get very little response. We do get a response. We're getting, you know, about, you know, 0.15 of a tonne of dry matter, but it's generally not paying to apply that last 20 kilos of nitrogen. So that's why I'm saying we're pairing our 125 back to say 105 or 100 kilos of nitrogen in the current year, and that's based on there's little response from that final 20 kilos of nitrogen because nitrogen has got so expensive. Like for example, it's costing us, say if we're using a urea based product, it's costing us 44 euros per hectare for that 20 kilos, and we're only getting back 32 euros worth of grass silage.
And to push you, Mark, like, you know, talking to a farmer who, you know, who hears those figures from you and they might run with that 80 kilos for 75% of the crop, or even push it down further. Is that something that you'd recommend, or would you be, I suppose, very strong on that 100 kilo figure you quote?
I think we should be aiming to maximise the yield, for the current year that we're in. So we're going to get a very good response in terms of grass growth. It's going to be a very responsive time. April, May is when we can grow most grass. The grass will use that nitrogen most efficiently, and especially in a year where indications are that fertilizer supply is going to be tight on the ground, that I think we close that little bit earlier for our first cut silage, and we fertilize it as best we can to make as big a cut of quality, first cut silage, come that last week of May, and that we can put in the pit, and that's very, very important for the winter ahead. And this is the right time to make that big first cut of silage. And that also leaves then they have more ground in terms of grazing later on in the year.
And if we consider the farmer in the situation where they were conservative at the start of the year in anticipation for a reduction in fertiliser cost, there are some farmers who don't have a lot of fertiliser in the yard and maybe not, at this point, not enough for their first cut application. There are alarm bells ringing at the moment in terms of the supply of fertiliser, and some merchants and some co-ops not quoting a figure for buying it and potentially not having a supply for farmers. I suppose, can you give us a picture of what's happening there, Mark, and what farmers can do about it?
Look, I suppose what's happening in the last 3 weeks, no one could predict. And again, Russia was supplying, and there's a lot of fertilizer coming out of Russia into Ireland, and again those supply lines now are not there. So again, yes, fertilizer is very, very tight on the ground, and we'd most definitely encourage farmers to contact their merchants and see where they are. Like, fertilizer will be available, it's just taking a little bit longer to get it into the country. As I said, there was boats destined for Ireland, but things have changed, and I suppose that's what's driving just the pressure on supplies at the moment.
And looking at the broader picture, we're talking about some practices we're doing now that are going to benefit us in 6, 7, 8 months' time. So when we talk about fertiliser for silage ground, it is essentially our winter feed we're creating. You've pointed out the response to fertiliser in April, May is at its highest point. And I suppose, given that, looking to winter feed, if we can't achieve a good first cut right now, what are the consequences for the winter period?
Well, again, I suppose it's trying to fill that fodder gap or that fodder shortage, and say, look, first cut silage is the number one that we all should be driving to maximise that cut. But if we have to buy expensive concentrate to replace that, or buying in silage or making second cut silage, they will all cost more than what we can grow first cut silage at this point in time. The response to that first 80 kilos is very good. We're getting over 5 tons of dry matter, and if you're to replace that with concentrate feed, it will cost you a lot more. So I think that has to be the priority on farms as we speak, is to maximize that first cut of silage.
I think this has been a really insightful conversation, Mark, and I think you've pointed out what the ideal is, and we can all strive to get there. We might not necessarily hit it this year, given supply and price issue, but the reality is what we do in the next 2 months will dictate, I suppose, how cheap or expensive the winter might come for specific farms. I think your point on contacting your merchant and having that two-way conversation to fully understand where supply is at and what maybe you need to do will be very useful and reassuring for farmers. I do also know that there is conversation, nationally in terms of, the fodder committee, and Teagasc have completed a fodder budget in the past where things have looked to be tight, and I'm sure that's something that will roll out across the year. I would also make the point, Mark, that, for anyone listening in today who is unsure about their own situation, your advisor is there to help, and they are at the end of the phone if you want to give them a call. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Mark Plunkett for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.